Picture this. It's 1857 in Paris, France. Imagine being a bona fide genius poet, trying your hardest to capture the raw, unvarnished, gritty reality of the modern city. And suddenly you find yourself facing actual, real-world prison time. Not for theft, not for treason, but simply for writing poems about modern life. It sounds crazy, right? Well, today in this explainer, we're diving deep into the dramatic and incredibly historic obscenity trial of Charles Baudelaire and his groundbreaking poetry collection, Les Fleurs du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil. So how did this all kick off? It actually started when a very expensive-looking, official cream-colored envelope arrived at Baudelaire's apartment. Inside, a criminal summons for outraged public morals. Now, you might think a criminal summons would cause instant panic, but Baudelaire, he actually laughed. He turned to his landlady with this dark, almost amused irony and said, "They think I have corrupted France." To his mind, he hadn't corrupted the nation at all. He had just described it with total, brutal accuracy. But as we'll see, the state felt very, very differently about that.
And guys, this was not some slow-moving, bureaucratic legal process. The escalation was whiplash fast. The book is published in June of 1857. By July, the government has already scoured it, picked out 6 specific poems, ones dealing with desire, the body, the darker sides of human nature, and issued that summons. And by August 20th, literally just weeks later, Baudelaire is standing in the 6th chamber of correctional police, staring down a judge. The sheer speed of this tells us exactly how threatened the establishment actually felt.
Section 1. The prosecution's moral crusade.
All right, let's step into the courtroom and meet our primary antagonist, Imperial Prosecutor Ernest Pinard. Pinard was a man of absolute, unshakable moral certainty. Plus, he had just narrowly lost a case against the novelist Gustave Flaubert earlier that same year, so his appetite for a conviction was incredibly sharp. He walks into that courtroom like a man on a divine mission, treating the book of poetry like a murder weapon. And his strategy, he weaponized a very specific legal definition. He didn't just argue that the poems contained vice. His specific interpretation was that obscenity occurs when a work presents vice without any moral condemnation. Pinard claimed Baudelaire was a master of sophisticated obscenity. Basically, by using gorgeous, metrically perfect verse to describe the grotesque or the highly sensual, the poetry sneaks past the reader's mental defenses and acts as a literal moral poison.
This right here brilliantly captures the core philosophical clash of the whole trial. On one side, you have the state's rigid demand. Pinard deeply believed art has a job to do. It must guide the reader, provide a moral compass, and demonstrate divine justice. On the other side, you have the poet's demand. Baudelaire believed art's only real duty was unvarnished realism, to observe without necessarily judging. It was a massive collision between the state's demand for public virtue and the artist's unwavering commitment to the truth.
Section 2. Defending the uncomfortable truth.
So who has to defend this uncomfortable truth? That nearly impossible job fell to Baudelaire's lawyer, Maître Gustave Shakes d'Estange. He was a highly successful, highly respectable attorney, and he had to somehow translate complex, rule-breaking poetry into the rigid, stuffy framework of 19th century law. Let's look at the exact evidence and how wildly different the two sides viewed the exact same words. Take the poem Les Bijoux, which is about a woman wearing only jewelry. The prosecution cries pornographic objectification. The defense? They argue it's a sophisticated exploration of the male gaze and how we perform as aesthetic objects. For Lesbos, the state saw a celebration of sexual deviance, while the defense saw an acknowledgement of human diversity rooted in ancient traditions. And then there's Une charogne, a poem literally about a rotting corpse. Pinard saw pure physical disgust. The defense argued it was actually a profound philosophical meditation on human mortality and time.
But see, underlying all of Baudelaire's poetry was this concept of ennui. Baudelaire was desperately trying to capture this new, modern alienation, an existential boredom that completely defined the rapidly industrializing city of Paris. It was this heavy feeling that traditional religion and modern commerce just couldn't fix. But as you might guess, this incredibly nuanced psychological concept was entirely lost on a rigid legal system that was only looking for simple, black and white categories of right and wrong.
Section 3. The witnesses take the stand.
Now the trial shifts into high gear, quickly pitting the conservative establishment, critics, doctors, priests, against the bohemian reality of artists and muses. This was a battle over who actually gets to dictate the impact of words on the human mind. And the dangers presented by the state's expert witnesses, they are truly fascinating. A medical doctor, Dr. Moreau, actually got up and testified that reading these poems literally reshapes a young person's neural architecture. He called it a physiological disease. Then, Father Arnaud, a theologian, testified that the poetry was a theological disease, that it introduced corrosive religious doubt and presented the flesh as more real than the spirit. They weren't just treating the book as a bad influence, they were treating it as a literal infection that had to be quarantined.
But the defense fought back, bringing profound pushback directly from Baudelaire's world. Enter Jeanne Duval, Baudelaire's longtime lover and muse. As a black woman in 19th century Paris, polite society completely marginalized her. The prosecution heavily suggested she should feel exploited by these poems, but instead, she takes the stand and delivers an absolute mic drop moment, arguing the poems proved her right to exist in art. She looked the prosecutor straight in the face and said, "If that threatens French law, then French law is too fragile to survive contact with reality." Wow, just wow.
Section 4. The poet refuses to apologize.
Which brings us to the climax of the trial, the moment Baudelaire himself takes the stand. Up to this point, his publisher and his lawyer had been practically begging him to be pragmatic. Just apologize, claim it was an artistic experiment gone horribly wrong, throw yourself on the mercy of the court. But Baudelaire? Absolutely not. He was completely unapologetic. When they pressed him about the explicit, disturbing details in his work, he just looked at the court and said, "Truth is often grotesque. Would you prefer I lie about it?" He actively ignored their advice to beg for mercy. He admitted his poems refused conventional pieties for a very simple reason. He found those conventional pieties to be completely hypocritical. He was the one on trial, sure, but in that moment, he was putting society's moral framework on trial right back.
Pinard even tried to press him on the title of the book itself, claiming that calling it The Flowers of Evil was basically a confession of guilt. But Baudelaire's defense of his own title was pure brilliance. He explained to the court that flowers are beautiful and temporary, while evil is ugly and permanent. By slamming those two words together, he was suggesting that the aesthetic and the moral are just not identical. He was telling those judges that even in the darkest darkness, even in absolute corruption, a poet can still excavate moments of breathtaking beauty.
Section 5. The verdict of time.
So what actually happened when the gavel finally fell? Well, Baudelaire was ultimately convicted and fined, and those 6 specific poems were totally banned from publication. But the legal judgment? That's really only half the story. The cultural impact is what echoes into the present day. Even before the verdict was read, the famous painter Édouard Manet presented this incredibly fascinating paradox. Manet argued that an acquittal would have actually been a total disaster. Why? Because it would mean the poems had been domesticated. They would have been proven safe enough for polite society, and they would have lost all their revolutionary power. But a conviction, losing that trial and being banned actually authenticated the devastating power of the art. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the poems were dangerous, authentic, and truly threatened the established social order. And that leaves us with a massive, lingering philosophical question. If art only confirms what we already believe, is it even still art? The trial of Les Fleurs du Mal shows us that the establishment almost always demands a mirror that flatters it. But Baudelaire, he provided a mirror that simply reflected the messy, complex, and sometimes really grotesque truth. It's a tension between the strict rigidity of the law and the unyielding nature of art that we are absolutely still grappling with today. Definitely something to chew on the next time a piece of art makes you feel truly uncomfortable.